My name is Rennie Calloway. I'm 44 years old. I've been a certified fraud examiner for 16 years, and in that time, I've traced $14 million in stolen money back to the people who stole it. 43 investigations. 43 closed files. I have never once let a name on an org chart change how I read a ledger. So when I opened the books of Pruitt Home Hardware 3 months ago and found 41 months of altered petty cash reconciliations, I recognized the handwriting before I recognized the numbers. Small, cramped, slanted hard to the right. The same handwriting that used to write my name on a schedule taped to a cash register. Rennie, 7 a.m. to 1 p.m. Christmas Day. I was 12 years old the first time my father made me work a holiday shift while my sister stayed home in her pajamas, unwrapping a bicycle I never got. I was 39 the last time. And I was 44, sitting in a glass-walled conference room with my father's boss, when I found out exactly what that handwriting had been hiding for the last 3.5 years. Welcome back to Gia Mom Stories, where women share the mornings that shaped them and the quiet skills that finally set things right. If a version of this has happened in your family, stay to the end, and don't forget to subscribe. Let me back up, because you need to understand who I am before you understand what I found. Callaway Hardware Feed sat on Route 9 outside Millbrook, Ohio, population 11,000. The kind of town where the volunteer fire department still ran a pancake breakfast every spring and everyone bought their fence posts from the same man for 30 years. My father, Walter Calloway, opened that store in 1987 with a $14,000 loan from Millbrook Savings and Loan and a handshake with a lumber supplier who trusted him because his own father had run a feed store 2 counties over. Walter built that business the way some men build a reputation, slowly, one satisfied customer at a time, one Saturday morning at a time, one extended line of credit to a farmer having a bad year at a time. By the time I was old enough to remember anything, Callaway Hardware was the only hardware store within 22 miles, and my father was the kind of man who knew every customer's name, every customer's tab, and every customer's business better than they sometimes knew it themselves. I loved that store. I want to say that clearly before I tell you the rest, because what happened to me inside those walls was never really about the store. It was about who my father decided I was, and who he decided my sister was, and how those 2 decisions calcified into the shape of my whole childhood. My sister, Diane, is 3 years older than me. Diane was born with the kind of face that made strangers stop on the sidewalk to compliment my mother, and my father never stopped seeing that face, not even when Diane was 30 and still asking him to cover her rent. Diane didn't work the counter at Callaway Hardware. Diane didn't stock shelves or run the register or learn how to reconcile a cash drawer to the penny before closing, the way my father taught me to do by the time I was 11. Diane took ballet lessons in Dayton on Saturdays, 40 minutes each way, and later art classes, and later still a series of business ventures my father funded and never once audited. Diane was, in my father's words, delicate. I was, in my father's words, capable. I have spent 30 years understanding that capable was a cage built out of a compliment. Here is the morning that set the shape of everything. I was 12. It was a Wednesday, which meant it was Christmas Day, 1993, though the year barely matters because it happened again the next year, and the year after that, and 11 more Christmases after that one, with only the numbers on the register changing. My mother, Carol Calloway, worked as a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses in town, including, unofficially, ours. She was a quiet woman who believed conflict was something you managed by staying very still until it passed. She never once told my father no in front of us. I understood later that she'd stopped telling him no in private, too, sometime around the year I turned 9, and that whatever peace she'd made with that decision was hers to make, not mine to judge. But I judged it anyway, for a long time. That Christmas morning, I came downstairs at 6:30 in my nightgown, the way any 12-year-old comes downstairs on Christmas, half asleep and already smiling at the shape of the tree in the dark living room. My father was already dressed. Work boots, flannel, the green canvas apron he wore behind the counter folded over his arm. "Rennie, get dressed," he said. "Feed store opens at 7. Ferguson's got a burst pipe out at the dairy farm and half the county's going to need salt and fittings before this cold snap breaks." I remember looking at the tree. For presents under it with my name on the tags, small ones, the kind you can tell by weight and shape are socks or a paperback. 11 presents with Diane's name on them, one of them shaped unmistakably like a bicycle frame, wrapped in silver paper with a bow the size of a dinner plate. "Can Diane come help too?" I asked. I remember exactly how I asked it, careful, not accusing, the way a 12-year-old asks a question she already suspects has a bad answer. "Diane's not built for the counter," my father said. He wasn't being cruel. That's the part that took me 20 years to understand. He said it the way you'd say a fact about the weather. You've got a head for numbers, Ren. Diane's got other gifts." I worked the register from 7 that morning until 1 in the afternoon. I remember a man named Elroy Ferguson coming in for pipe fittings, snow still melting off his boots onto the mat, and telling me I had my father's hands for counting change. I remember eating a ham sandwich behind the counter at noon because my father had forgotten, or hadn't thought, to bring me anything else. I remember driving home at 1:15 and walking into a living room where the wrapping paper had already been gathered into a trash bag, where my sister was riding her new bicycle in slow circles around the coffee table because it was too cold to take it outside, where the 4 small presents with my name on them sat untouched on the couch, waiting for me to open them alone, 20 minutes before my mother started dinner. I opened them by myself. 2 pairs of socks. A paperback mystery novel. A calculator, the kind with the paper tape, because my father had noticed I liked adding up the register totals for fun. "I want to tell you," I cried. I didn't. I want to tell you I understood, even then, what I was watching happen to me. I didn't understand that either. What I understood, at 12, in the specific and limited way a 12-year-old understands anything, was that showing up and being useful got you a calculator, and being delicate and photogenic got you a bicycle, and that the second option looked, from where I was standing, like the better deal. It would take me another decade to understand that what I actually got, underneath the socks and the calculator, was a skill. My father had handed me, without meaning to, without ever once saying it out loud, the ability to read a room, balance a ledger, and notice when something didn't add up. He thought he was building free labor. He was training an auditor. There's a second Christmas morning I want to tell you about, because it's the one that finally taught me not to expect anything different. I was 16. By then I'd stopped hoping the schedule would change, but some stubborn part of me still checked the tree every year, the way you check a lottery ticket you already suspect is worthless. That year, Diane's pile held a car stereo system, a leather jacket, and a gift certificate for a weekend trip to Cedar Point with 3 of her friends, all expenses paid. My pile held a flashlight, a set of winter gloves, and a store apron with my name embroidered on the pocket in the same green thread my father used for the staff uniforms. He'd had it made specially. I remember him handing it to me and saying, "Figured it was time you had your own, seeing as you're basically running the place some Saturdays anyway." He meant it as an honor. I wore that apron to the register 4 hours later, and somewhere around 10 that morning, a woman came in for a space heater and told me how lucky my father was to have a daughter who loved the family business so much. I didn't correct her. I didn't know yet how to explain that loving a business and being permanently assigned to it are not the same thing, and that no one had ever actually asked me which one this was. My father never hit us. He never raised his voice more than the occasional gruff correction over an incorrectly stocked shelf. If you'd met him at a Rotary Club dinner or watched him extend credit to a farmer 3 months behind on a feed bill, you'd have called him one of the kindest men in Millbrook, and you wouldn't have been wrong. That's the part of this story people struggle with the most when I've told pieces of it to friends over the years. My father wasn't a villain in the way villains get written. He was a man who had decided, somewhere early on, probably before I was even born, that love came in two currencies: protection for the daughter he considered fragile, and usefulness for the daughter he considered strong. He never once weighed whether that division was fair. He simply never had to, because I never stopped showing up, and showing up, to him, looked exactly like consent. That pattern held for 11 more years. Every Christmas from the time I was 12 until the year I turned 23 and moved 4 hours away for graduate school, I worked the holiday shift at Callaway Hardware while Diane stayed home. Every birthday, every school event, every parent-teacher conference, followed some version of the same math. Diane's ballet recital got both parents in the front row. My regional finals in the state accounting competition, the one I won at 16, got my mother in the back row alone, because my father was at the store covering for the one employee who'd asked for the day off. I'm not telling you this to build sympathy. I'm telling you this because everything that happened 5 years ago only makes sense if you understand the shape of the training I received. My father built me into someone who documents. Someone who doesn't confront until she's certain. Someone who reads a ledger the way other people read a room, looking for the thing that's been smoothed over, the entry that's technically correct but somehow still wrong. I left Millbrook at 18 for Ohio State, accounting major, because numbers were the one language in my house that never lied to me. I earned my CPA at 23, my CFE certification at 28, and by 30 I was working forensic engagements for a regional advisory firm out of Columbus, the kind of work where companies call you in quietly, after hours, when they suspect someone on the inside is stealing from them and they can't yet prove it. I built a reputation for being thorough, unemotional, and very hard to fool. Clients described me, more than once, using the word my father used when I was 12. Capable. I learned to hear that word differently as an adult. I learned it could be a compliment that didn't cost the person saying it anything at all. Diane, meanwhile, spent her 20s and 30s the way she'd spent her childhood, supported. My father co-signed 2 car loans for her, both of which he ended up paying in full after she stopped making payments. He funded a candle business in 2011 that lost $18,000 in 14 months. He funded a boutique clothing store in 2016 that lost $31,000 in 2 years. He never once asked her for a business plan, a profit and loss statement, or a receipt. When I asked him, gently, at a Thanksgiving dinner in 2015, whether he'd looked at Diane's numbers before writing another check, he told me I'd always been the suspicious one. He said it fondly, like it was a personality trait, the way you'd describe someone as ticklish. I want to pause here and tell you something about my mother, because she matters to this story even though she stayed quiet through most of it. Carol Calloway died of a stroke in the spring of 2019, 6 years ago now, at 68 years old. I found out later, going through her personal file box after the funeral, that she'd kept a small ledger of her own for decades, a running private tally of every dollar my father gave Diane that he didn't give me, going back to 1998. Christmas gifts. Car repairs. Rent covers. The total, by the year she died, was $211,000. She never showed it to anyone. She never confronted him. But she counted. My mother, it turned out, was an auditor too. She just never filed her report. I built my career the same slow, deliberate way my father built his store, except I built it around the exact skill he'd handed me by accident. My first job out of graduate school was as a staff auditor at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, reconciling accounts payable for manufacturing clients, dull, careful work that most people my age found tedious and I found, honestly, soothing. There was something about a column of numbers that had to balance, no matter how you felt about the people who'd entered them, that felt like the first honest system I'd ever been handed. By 26 I'd moved into the firm's small forensic division, working alongside investigators twice my age who'd spent decades learning to read intent into a spreadsheet the way a detective reads intent into a crime scene. I earned my CFE certification at 28, sat for the exam in a testing center in downtown Columbus on a gray October morning, and called my mother from the parking lot afterward to tell her I'd passed. She was quiet on the line for a moment, and then she said, "Your father's going to tell everyone at Rotary his daughter's a detective now." I remember thinking, even then, that she said it a little sadly, like she already understood something about how he'd frame it that I wouldn't understand myself for another 16 years. I inherited that ledger, literally, in a manila folder in a cardboard box. I read it once, the week after the funeral, sitting on the floor of her sewing room with the box open in front of me, and then I put it away in a drawer in my own home in Columbus and didn't look at it again for almost 5 years. I told myself the accounting of my childhood was closed. I was wrong. It was only dormant, the way a discrepancy sits quiet in a ledger until someone finally reconciles the account. 5 years ago, in the spring of 2020, my father sold Callaway Hardware Feed. He was 68, his knees were failing him, and the pandemic had scrambled the supply chains he'd spent 33 years learning to navigate. He sold the business, the building, and the inventory to a man named Gordon Pruitt, who owned 3 other hardware stores across 2 counties and had been trying to buy Callaway Hardware for a decade. Gordon kept the location, renamed it Pruitt Home Hardware, and, as part of the sale agreement, kept my father on as store manager at a salary of $51,000 a year plus a small profit-sharing bonus tied to the store's annual performance. My father took the deal because he didn't know how to be anything other than the man behind that counter, and because, I suspect, 68 years of building something and then handing the keys to someone else terrified him in a way he never said out loud. For 5 years, he ran that store for another man. Same aisles. Same register. Different name on the sign, different name on the tax filings, and, as I would find out, a very different and very deliberate set of numbers moving quietly underneath. 3 months ago, I got a call at my office in Columbus from a number I didn't recognize. Rennie Callaway? This is Gordon Pruitt. Your father's employer. He paused in a way I've learned, in 16 years of this work, to recognize. People pause like that right before they say something they've been avoiding saying for weeks. I got your name from a colleague of mine in Dayton. She said you do forensic work. Fraud examinations. I need someone to look at my Millbrook store's books, and I need someone who won't have any reason to go easy on whatever they find. I sat very still at my desk. Mr. Pruitt, you understand that Walter Callaway is my father. I know, he said. That's exactly why I called you. I've had 3 managers flag inconsistencies in that store's petty cash and vendor reconciliations over the past year, and every time I've raised it with your father, he's had an explanation that sounds fine until you look at it twice. I need someone who'll look at it twice and not stop there because it's uncomfortable. My other managers know your father. They like him. They don't want to be the one who finds something. I figured his own daughter, a professional one, might be exactly the person who won't flinch. Stay with me, because I need you to sit in that moment with me the way I sat in it. Gordon Pruitt was asking me to formally investigate my own father for suspected embezzlement, in the same building where, 32 years earlier, that same man had handed me a calculator instead of a bicycle and called it fair because I was capable and my sister was delicate. I told Gordon I needed 48 hours to think about it. I hung up the phone, and I drove home, and I opened the drawer where I'd kept my mother's ledger for 5 years, and I read it again from the first entry to the last. Then I called Gordon back and told him I'd take the engagement, on one condition, that I would follow the evidence exactly where it led, and that he would not ask me to soften anything I found because of who my father was to me. He agreed. I want to be honest with you about something. I didn't take that case because I wanted revenge on my father. I took it because I have built my entire adult life around one core belief, the same belief my mother apparently held in silence for 20 years. The numbers tell the truth, whether or not anyone wants to hear it. If my father's books were clean, I would have found that too, and I would have told Gordon Pruitt exactly that, and gone home. I didn't go into that engagement assuming guilt. 16 years of forensic work teaches you not to assume anything before you've traced every dollar. I traced every dollar. It took me 11 weeks. And it led exactly where a small, cramped, right-slanted handwriting had been quietly leading it for 3.5 years. I started the way I start every engagement, with a materiality threshold and a full population of transactions, not a sample. Gordon gave me red access to 5 years of Pruitt Home Hardware's Millbrook location records, general ledger entries, vendor invoices, petty cash logs, point-of-sale reconciliations, and bank statements for the store's operating account. I set up shop in a spare office at Gordon's headquarters in Dayton, 40 minutes from Millbrook, close enough to visit the store when I needed physical documents, far enough that my father wouldn't see my car in the lot every day. Week 1, I built a baseline. Before you can find what's wrong, you have to know exactly what right looks like. I mapped the store's normal cash flow patterns, seasonal inventory swings, typical vendor payment cycles. Callaway Hardware, now Pruitt Home Hardware, ran on roughly the same rhythm it always had. Heavy spring and fall for lawn and garden. A bump every December for gift items and holiday lighting. Steady year-round traffic in plumbing, electrical, and fasteners. Nothing about the shape of the business itself surprised me. I'd grown up inside that shape. Week 2, I found the first irregularity, and it was small enough that I almost filed it under normal variance and moved on. The kind of thing that, if you weren't trained to distrust small things, you'd wave off. A petty cash reconciliation from November of 3 years prior showed a $14 discrepancy between the register tape and the deposited total. $14 is nothing. $14 is a rounding error, a miscounted roll of quarters. But I've learned something in 16 years of this work: fraud almost never starts big. It starts at $14, because $14 is small enough that no one checks. And once someone learns that no one checks, the number grows. I pulled every petty cash reconciliation for the following month. $22 short. The month after that, $31 short. By month 6 of that pattern, the shortages had grown to just under $200 a month, always under the $250 threshold that would have triggered an automatic flag in Pruitt's accounting software. Someone who worked at that store understood exactly where the review threshold sat, and stayed just beneath it. That's not sloppiness. That's design. Week 3, I cross-referenced the petty cash shortages against vendor invoice records, and this is where the pattern stopped being small. I found 3 vendor names on the invoice ledger that didn't match any vendor in Pruitt Home Hardware's approved supplier list. Meridian Fastener Supply, Lakeview Tool Distributors, Route 9 Hardware Wholesale. All 3 billed the store for plumbing fittings, electrical components, and general hardware stock, in amounts ranging from $400 to $1,800 per invoice, always paid by check from the store's petty cash and small purchase account rather than through the corporate accounts payable system that Gordon's other 3 stores used exclusively. Fraud examiners call this kind of structuring a layering pattern, designed to make each individual transaction look boring enough that it never earns a second glance, while the aggregate quietly does the real damage. I've seen the same architecture in car dealerships, in non-profit foundations, in a school district's supply budget once, 3 states away, that I still think about sometimes when I drive past an elementary school. The specifics change. The architecture almost never does. I know every legitimate hardware and building supply distributor in a 60-mile radius of Millbrook, Ohio. I grew up hearing those names at the dinner table the way other children heard sports scores. Meridian Fastener Supply, Lakeview Tool Distributors, and Route 9 Hardware Wholesale were not among them. I checked the Ohio Secretary of State's business registry. None of the 3 companies had a registered business filing in the state. I checked the phone numbers listed on the invoices. 2 were disconnected. The 3rd rang through to a voicemail box that had never been set up. 3 ghost vendors. 41 invoices over 3.5 years. I laid them out on the desk in my Dayton office the way I lay out every fraud case, chronologically, and the total came to $68,000 for $100. Week 4, I needed to know where that money had actually gone, because ghost vendors don't cash their own checks. Someone at Pruitt Home Hardware was writing checks to companies that didn't exist and then depositing or cashing those checks personally. I pulled the endorsement records from the store's bank, First Millbrook Trust, using the authorization Gordon had given me as the engagement's authorized examiner. Every one of the 41 checks made out to Meridian Fastener Supply, Lakeview Tool Distributors, or Route 9 Hardware Wholesale had been endorsed with a stamp reading for deposit only and routed into a single personal checking account. The account belonged to Walter Calloway. I sat with that for longer than I want to admit. I want to be honest with you, the way I'd want any of you to be honest with yourselves in this position. I am a professional. I have found fathers stealing from sons, sisters stealing from brothers, trusted employees of 30 years stealing from companies that gave them everything. I know, intellectually, that this happens, that people you love are still capable of taking what isn't theirs. Knowing it in theory and finding your own father's endorsement stamp on a fraudulent check are 2 very different kinds of knowing. I did what I always do when a case gets personal enough to blur my judgment. I called Denise Okafor. Denise and I trained together at the same Columbus firm 16 years ago. She's a CFE like me, now a partner at her own boutique forensic practice, and she's the person I call when I need someone to check my objectivity before I trust it myself. I drove to her office that same evening and laid out everything I had. The petty cash shortages. The 3 ghost vendors. The 41 invoices. The endorsement records. Denise read the file for close to an hour without saying anything, the way I'd trained myself, and apparently her too, to read a file. When she looked up, she asked me one question. Do you have anywhere near enough here to know where the money went after it hit his personal account, or does it just stop at the deposit? That was the right question, and I didn't have the answer yet. Knowing my father had received $68,000 in stolen funds told me he was guilty of theft. It didn't tell me the whole story. 16 years of this work has taught me that the destination of stolen money is often more revealing than the theft itself. People steal for reasons, and the reasons show up in the spending. Week 5, I pulled my father's personal bank statements, which Gordon's engagement letter with me authorized as part of the full financial trace, since the funds had originated from company assets. I want to walk you through what I found the way I found it, in order, because the order matters. $11,200 over 14 months, in transfers to an account belonging to Diane Calloway Voss. My sister. $9,000 in a single wire transfer 18 months ago, to a landlord in Dayton, memo line reading D. Calloway Rent Assistance. $14,600, spread across 19 transactions, to a company called Bloom Vine Event Design, which I traced, with one phone call, to a floral and event styling business Diane had launched 2 years earlier and which had, according to her own since-deleted business page, closed within 11 months. The remaining balance, roughly $33,000, sat scattered across smaller, harder-to-trace expenditures. Credit card payments. A used car down payment, again for Diane, again documented in the loan paperwork I later obtained through Denise's contact at the dealership. A repeated string of $400 Venmo transfers, monthly, memo line simply reading for you, sweetheart. My father had stolen $68,400 from a man who trusted him enough to keep him running the store he'd built, and every documented dollar of it, every single traceable cent, had gone to fund my sister's life. Her rent. Her car. Her failed business. Her monthly allowance, at 54 years old, from a father who once told me I was too capable to need help. I want to tell you what that felt like, sitting in my office at 11 o'clock at night with a spreadsheet open in front of me and 32 years of Christmas mornings finally, fully explained. It didn't feel like anger, not at first. It felt like the specific, cold clarity of a ledger finally balancing. Every column I'd never been able to reconcile as a child, why the socks, why the calculator, why the empty back row at my own award ceremonies, suddenly closed out to zero. My father had never stopped making the same choice. He'd just gotten better at hiding it from everyone except a company's books, and books, unlike children, don't stay quiet about it forever. Before I moved into week 6, I want to tell you about the one night that almost derailed the whole engagement, because a case like this doesn't move in a straight line, and I don't want to pretend mine did. It was the end of week 5, a Sunday night, and I drove out to Millbrook without telling anyone, not Gordon, not Denise, and parked across the street from the store the way I used to imagine private investigators did in the paperback mysteries my father had once given me instead of a bicycle. I sat in my car for almost an hour watching the lights go off inside, watching my father lock the front door the same way he'd locked it every night of my childhood, testing the handle twice out of habit before he walked to his truck. I wasn't there to confront him. I told myself I was there to see the building one more time before I finished tearing apart everything it stood for, but the truth, the one I only admitted to Denise later, was that some small, stubborn part of me was hoping to find a reason to stop. A version of the story where the money had gone somewhere defensible. A medical bill. A debt from before I was born. Anything that wasn't simply Diane, again, the same as it had always been. I called Denise from that parking lot. I keep hoping I'm going to find something that makes this make sense in a way that isn't just the same thing it's always been, I told her. Rennie, you're a forensic accountant, she said, gently, in the voice she uses when she's about to say something I don't want to hear but need to. You don't get to hope the ledger says something different than what it says. That's the entire job. You taught me that, back at the Columbus firm, my first year, on my first case. You told me the numbers don't care what story we want them to tell. Go home. Finish the trace. Let it say what it says. I drove home that night and didn't touch the file again until Tuesday morning, when I finished the outbound trace with a clear head instead of a hopeful one. I tell you this part because I think it matters, in a story like this, to admit that even someone who spent 16 years being the person who checks the numbers still occasionally wants, just once, for the numbers to be wrong. Week 6, I brought my findings to Denise formally, structured the way I structure every case file I've ever built, executive summary on top, source documents behind it, everything traceable back to a bank record or a public filing. Denise reviewed it line by line and told me it was airtight. Then she asked me the question I'd been avoiding. What do you want to do with this, Rennie? Professionally, you report to Gordon Pruitt. That's the engagement. But this is also your father. What do you actually want? I told her the truth. I wanted Gordon to have a complete, defensible report so he could make an informed decision about his own business. And I wanted, for the first time in 32 years, to sit across a table from my father and my sister and let the numbers say out loud what I had never been allowed to say as a child. Week 7 through 9, I finished the trace. I want to give you the full shape of it, because a case like this isn't one number, it's a pattern, and the pattern is what makes it undeniable. 41 fraudulent invoices from 3 fictitious vendors, dated across 3 years and 5 months. Total stolen from Pruitt Home Hardware's petty cash and small purchase accounts, $68,400. Of that total, $59,800 traced directly to documented transfers, payments, or purchases benefiting Diane Calloway Voss. The remaining $8,600 sat in unexplained cash withdrawals, all occurring within 72 hours of a corresponding fraudulent invoice payment, a pattern consistent, in my professional opinion, with cash handed directly to a third party off the books, likely also to Diane, though I could not trace those specific dollars to a bank record the way I could trace the rest. I also found, buried in an old email thread on the store's shared computer, which Gordon had authorized me to review as part of the engagement, a message from my father to Diane dated 14 months earlier. The subject line read "Car help." The body read, in full, "Don't worry about the paperwork. I'll figure out where it comes from. You just focus on getting back on your feet. Love you more than anything, Dad." I printed that email. I want you to understand why that single sentence mattered more to my case file than any invoice. Every fraudulent document I'd found proved theft. That email proved intent, and it proved something else, something that had nothing to do with the legal case and everything to do with the child I used to be. Don't worry about the paperwork. I'll figure out where it comes from. My father had spent 3.5 years figuring out where it comes from for a 54-year-old woman who had never once, in her entire life, been asked to account for a single dollar. He had never once, in my entire life, offered to figure out where anything came from for me. I had always been expected to figure it out myself, because I was capable. Week 10, I called Gordon Pruitt and told him the engagement was complete. I asked for 2 things before I delivered the final report. First, that he allow me to be present, alongside him, when the findings were formally presented, because I had personal information relevant to the case, specifically my mother's private ledger, that would help explain the pattern's full scope even though it fell outside the formal engagement. Second, that he loop in Pruitt Home Hardware's outside counsel, a Dayton attorney named Marcus Felt, so the meeting would carry the legal weight required if my father chose not to cooperate. Gordon agreed to both. He also told me something that stuck with me. "Rennie, I want you to know, whatever happens with your father personally, you did exactly what I hired you to do. You didn't flinch. Most people would have." I called Denise and asked her to be present as an independent witness, a second set of trained eyes who could speak to the methodology if anyone later challenged it. She agreed immediately, the way she always has, in 16 years, whenever I've needed her to simply show up and be steady. Then I did the hardest thing in the entire 11 weeks. I called my father and asked him and Diane to meet me at the store, after hours, on a Thursday evening. I told him it concerned a financial review Gordon had asked me to conduct. I didn't tell him what I'd found. I wanted him to walk into that room the same way I'd walked into so many rooms as a child, without warning, without preparation, expected simply to show up and perform whatever version of himself the day required. Stay with me, because this is the part I've replayed more times than any other moment of my adult life. Thursday evening, 6:30, Pruitt Home Hardware, Millbrook, Ohio. Same building. Same green trim on the windows, repainted once in 38 years but the same color my father chose in 1987. The same brass bell over the door that used to announce Elroy Ferguson coming in for pipe fittings on a Christmas morning 30 years earlier. Gordon had cleared the small break room in the back for the meeting, a rectangular table, 6 chairs, fluorescent lighting, a coffee maker that had clearly been used recently by someone nervous. I arrived first, at 6, with Denise, and we set up the file. I want to describe this the way I set it up, because the structure was deliberate. On the table, in a black binder with numbered tabs, 94 pages, Tab 1, the petty cash reconciliation trail. Tab 2, the 3 fictitious vendor profiles, complete with the failed registry searches and disconnected phone numbers. Tab 3, the 41 fraudulent invoices, each annotated with date, amount, and corresponding check number. Tab 4, the bank endorsement records tracing every check to my father's personal account. Tab 5, the outbound trace, the transfers, the rent payment, the event design business, the car down payment, the monthly Venmo transfers, all cross-referenced to Diane's name. Tab 6, the email. Don't worry about the paperwork. Gordon arrived at 6:15 with Marcus Felt, the attorney, who sat at the end of the table with a legal pad and said very little for most of the meeting, the way good attorneys do when the documentation is strong enough to speak for itself. My father walked in at 6:28, 2 minutes early, still in his green work apron, the same style he'd worn every day of my childhood, though this one had Pruitt Home Hardware stitched where Callaway Hardware Feed used to be. He looked older than I let myself notice most years. 73 now. Slower in the knees. He smiled when he saw me, the easy, unsuspecting smile of a man who has never once imagined the person across the table might be the person who finally checks his work. Ren. Gordon said this was a review. Didn't know it'd be a family reunion. He glanced at Denise, then at Marcus Felt, and something in his posture changed, subtle, the kind of recalibration I've watched 100 subjects make the moment they realize a room has more weight in it than they expected. Diane arrived 4 minutes later, apologizing for traffic, wearing a coat I recognized, with a little too much familiarity, as the kind of coat that costs more than a month of what I used to make. Working weekend shifts at the store she'd never once had to work. She sat next to our father. She still hadn't looked directly at me. Have a seat, Diane, I said. My voice was even. I'd practiced that evenness the way I practice every closing presentation, not because I needed to fake calm, but because calm, delivered at the right pace, is the only tone that lets numbers land at their full weight. This won't take long if everyone lets me finish before we discuss it. Gordon opened. Walter, over the past year, 3 separate managers flagged inconsistencies in this store's petty cash and vendor accounts. I asked Rennie to conduct an independent forensic review, given her qualifications. I want to be direct with you before we go further. This review is complete, and the findings are serious. I asked her to present them here, with counsel present, so we can discuss next steps as a business matter. My father's eyes moved to me. Not panicked yet. Confused, maybe, the specific confusion of a man who has spent 3.5 years believing no one was ever going to check his work, the same way, I imagine, he believed for 30 years that no one would ever add up what he gave one daughter against what he gave the other. I opened the binder to tab 1. Dad, I want to walk you through what I found, in order, the way I'd walk any client through it. I'd ask you not to interrupt until I'm finished, Because every claim in this file is sourced to a bank record or a public document, and interrupting won't change what the documents say. I laid out the petty cash pattern first, the $14 shortage that grew, month over month, always staying just under the review threshold. I watched my father's jaw tighten the way it used to tighten when a supplier tried to shortchange him on a delivery. I moved to tab 2. 3 vendors. Meridian Fastener Supply. Lakeview Tool Distributors. Route 9 Hardware Wholesale. None of these companies exist, Dad. No state registration. No working phone number. I know every legitimate distributor within 60 miles of this store. You taught me most of their names yourself, at our kitchen table, when I was 9 years old. I placed the failed registry search printouts on the table. Diane shifted in her chair. She hadn't yet understood where this was going. I could see it in her face, the specific blankness of someone assuming, still, that whatever was happening belonged entirely to someone else's story. Tab 3. The 41 invoices, spread across the table the way Denise and I had rehearsed, chronologically, dates and amounts visible. 41 fraudulent invoices, submitted and approved for payment over 3 years and 5 months. Total, $68,400, paid entirely from petty cash and small purchase funds, structured specifically to stay beneath the automatic review threshold in Pruitt's accounting system. My father's hands, resting on the table, had gone very still. Tab 4. The endorsement records. I placed the bank documents in front of him, each check image with the for deposit only stamp clearly visible, routed to a single account. Every one of these 41 checks was endorsed and deposited into your personal checking account, Dad. Account ending 4471 at First Millbrook Trust. I didn't have to guess where the money went first. The bank told me. Ren, he started. I'm not finished, I said, the same evenness, the same pace. You'll have every chance to respond. I need you to hear the whole thing first, the way I never got to say anything at all until I was finished with a full shift, back when I was the one being told to wait. I opened tab 5. This was the part that mattered most, and I watched Diane's face change as I laid it out, piece by piece, because until this exact moment, I don't believe my sister had ever once considered that the money simply appearing in her life for the last 3.5 years had a cost attached to it, a source, a person on the other end of the transaction who hadn't consented to giving it. $11,200, transferred to Diane over 14 months. $9,000, wired to a Dayton landlord, memo line, rent assistance. $14,600 to Bloom and Vine Event Design, Diane's business, which closed within 11 months. A used car down payment. And a recurring monthly transfer, $400, memo line, for you, sweetheart. I let that sit exactly the way I'd learned to let evidence sit, in silence, because in 16 years I have never once found a way to make a number land harder than the silence right after you say it out loud. Diane's voice cracked first. Dad, did you? My father didn't answer her. He was looking at me, and something in his face had shifted from confusion into something closer to recognition, the specific look of a man watching a bill finally come due that he had genuinely convinced himself would never arrive. I opened tab 6. This is an email you sent Diane 14 months ago, Dad. Subject line, car help. You wrote, and I'm quoting exactly, don't worry about the paperwork. I'll figure out where it comes from. You just focus on getting back on your feet. I set the printout down gently. I want you to know something. That sentence is the only piece of evidence in this entire file that isn't about the theft. Everything else proves what you did. That sentence proves why. You spent 3.5 years figuring out where it comes from, For a 54-year-old woman who has never once had to figure that out herself in her whole life. I looked up from the binder and, for the first time since I'd walked into that break room, I let myself speak as a daughter instead of an examiner, though I kept my voice at the same steady register I'd used for every page before it. I worked the Christmas morning shift at this store for 11 years, Dad, starting when I was 12, while Diane opened presents at home. You called me capable. I understand now that capable meant I didn't need to be figured out for. I could figure it out myself. Diane never had to, because you never stopped figuring it out for her, even when it meant stealing from a man who trusted you enough to keep you running the store you built. You took $68,400 that belonged to Gordon Pruitt, and every dollar of it went to prove, one more time, which daughter you'd choose. My father put his head down. Not immediately. For a long moment he just looked at the table, at the binder, at the 41 invoices fanned out in front of him like a hand of cards he'd finally been forced to show. When he spoke, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. I didn't think anyone would ever check, he said. 38 years, I ran that store, and nobody ever once checked my numbers. I figured it'd be the same here. Somebody always checks eventually, Dad, I said. I just happened to be the somebody you trained to do it. Gordon spoke then, quiet but clear, the tone of a man who had let a family finish its business before returning to his own. Walter, I want to be straightforward with you, because you've worked for me for 5 years and I don't take any pleasure in this. This file documents felony-level theft under Ohio law. $68,400 exceeds the threshold for aggravated theft as a second-degree felony. Marcus can speak to the specifics, but I want you to understand the seriousness before we discuss what happens next. Marcus Felt finally spoke. Mr. Calloway, given the documentation my colleague has assembled, which is, frankly, some of the cleanest forensic work I've reviewed in 20 years of practice, Mr. Pruitt has several options. Criminal referral to the county prosecutor. Civil suit for full restitution plus damages. Or, and this is Mr. Pruitt's call entirely, a negotiated restitution agreement that avoids criminal referral if the full amount is repaid on a defined schedule and employment is terminated immediately. Gordon looked at my father for a long moment. Walter, I bought this store because I respected what you built here for 33 years. I kept you on because the town trusted you, and because, frankly, I liked you. I'm not interested in sending a 73-year-old man to prison if I don't have to. But you stole from me for 3.5 years, and you need to hear that clearly before we go any further. I want full restitution. $68,400 on a schedule Marcus and my accountant will structure, secured against your pension and any assets you're willing to put forward. Your employment here ends tonight. And I want it understood, by everyone at this table, that the only reason there isn't a police officer walking through that door right now is that your daughter asked me, before this meeting started, to give you the chance to make this right without a criminal record attached to your name. I hadn't told anyone that part of the story, not even Denise. I'd called Gordon 2 nights before the meeting and asked him, if the evidence supported it, and if he was willing, to offer restitution before referral. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't mercy, exactly, though it might look like mercy from the outside. It was that I had spent 32 years wanting my father to see me clearly, and I understood, somewhere in week 9 of that investigation, that the version of justice that mattered most to me wasn't a courtroom. It was this room. It was him, finally, unable to look away from what the numbers actually said. My father looked at me across the table. You did this for me? I did this because it was the truth, Dad. I gave Gordon the option to offer restitution because some small part of me still wanted to give you the chance to make it right instead of just watching you fall. That's not the same thing as forgiving what you did. I need you to understand the difference, because I've spent a long time learning it myself. Diane hadn't spoken in several minutes. When she finally did, her voice carried the particular defensiveness of someone who has just watched the floor disappear from underneath a life she never once questioned. I didn't know where any of it came from. He never told me it was stolen. He just said he wanted to help. I believe that you didn't ask, Diane, I said. I don't believe you didn't wonder. You took $11,200 in transfers, a $9,000 rent payment, $14,600 for a business that failed within a year, a car down payment, and $400 a month for over a year, from a 73-year-old man on a $51,000 salary, and it never once occurred to you to ask where a man making that salary was finding that kind of money. I'm not accusing you of forging the invoices. I'm telling you that not asking is its own kind of choice, and you've been making that choice, comfortably, for a long time. Marcus Felt cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Ms. Calloway Voss, receipt of funds you had reasonable cause to suspect were obtained illegitimately can carry its own civil exposure. Mr. Pruitt hasn't indicated an intention to pursue that against you today, but I'd encourage you to take that seriously going forward. Diane went pale. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the meeting. My father spoke again, quietly, mostly to himself, but the room was silent enough that everyone heard it. 38 years I stood behind that counter. I built every shelf in this building with my own hands. I never once thought I'd be the one somebody had to build a case against. He looked at the binder, then at me. You built this whole thing. All of it. Just you. I had a witness verify the methodology, I said, nodding toward Denise. But yes. I built it. The same way you taught me to reconcile a drawer to the penny before closing, back when I was 11 years old and you didn't think it was strange to expect that from a child. You trained me for this, Dad, even if it's not the job you had in mind. He didn't answer that. Gordon let the silence sit for a moment before continuing, laying out the specifics of the restitution schedule, the monthly amount, the lien against the pension, the timeline Marcus would formalize in writing by the end of the following week. My father listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table, nodding at the appropriate places, the posture of a man agreeing to terms he no longer had any standing to negotiate. Diane finally looked at me directly for the first time since she'd sat down. Did you enjoy this? She asked. Her voice wasn't quite an accusation. It was closer to genuine confusion, the tone of someone who has never once had to build a case for anything in her life and cannot imagine why anyone would choose to. No, Diane, I said. I didn't enjoy it. I spent 11 weeks confirming, one document at a time, that the thing I suspected about our family since I was 12 years old was true. There's no version of that which feels good. It just finally feels accurate. I've spent my whole career preferring accurate to comfortable. Tonight wasn't an exception. I closed the binder. 94 pages, numbered, tabbed, sourced. There's one more thing, I said, and I reached into my bag and pulled out the second file, the one that had nothing to do with Gordon Pruitt's engagement at all. My mother's ledger, photocopied, 20 pages of her small, careful handwriting, decades of quiet tallying she never once showed anyone while she was alive. This isn't part of Gordon's case, Dad. This is Mom's. She kept a private record, for over 20 years, of every dollar you gave Diane that you didn't give me. Christmas gifts. Car repairs. Rent covers, going back to before I even left for college. I found it in her things after she died, 6 years ago, and I put it in a drawer because I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I was wrong. It mattered enough that when Gordon called me 3 months ago, some part of me had been waiting my whole life for exactly this phone call. Mom counted for 20 years and never said a word. I think, in the end, that's the part of this whole story that breaks my heart the most. Not what you did to Gordon. What you did to both of us, for so long, without either of us ever telling you to stop. My father didn't defend himself after that. He signed the restitution agreement Marcus drafted over the following 2 weeks, $68,400, secured against a lien on his pension and the sale of a small parcel of land he still owned outside town, payable over 4 years. His employment at Pruitt Home Hardware ended that Thursday night. He never went back inside the building his own hands had built. Here's what happened in the months after. My father moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Millbrook, the kind with a small kitchenette and a view of the parking lot, 6 blocks from the store that no longer carries his name on the sign. He makes his restitution payments on schedule every month, and Marcus's office confirmed to Gordon, through me, that the first 4 installments cleared without issue. He called me twice in the first month after that meeting. I let both calls go to voicemail. I called him back the 3rd time, not because I'd forgiven him, but because 16 years of forensic work has also taught me something about closed files. Closing a case doesn't mean the people in it stop being people. We talk now, occasionally, briefly, mostly about small things. He hasn't asked me to forgive him. I think some part of him finally understands that forgiveness isn't a number you can restructure into a payment plan. Diane and I don't speak. She sent one email, 2 months after the meeting, that opened with an apology and closed, within 4 sentences, with a request for a loan to cover a security deposit. I didn't respond. I think that email told me everything I actually needed to know about whether anything underneath the surface had genuinely changed. Gordon Pruitt hired me for 2 more engagements at his other locations this past year, unrelated to my father, standard preventive audits. He told me, at the end of the second one, that hiring me for the Millbrook Review was one of the harder calls he'd made as a business owner, and one of the ones he was most glad he'd made. I told him that made 2 of us. I still keep my mother's ledger in that same drawer. I added one final line to it myself, in my own handwriting, the week after the meeting at the store. I wrote the total restitution figure, $68,400, and beside it, a single note, closed, verified, paid in full. It's the only entry in that entire 20-year ledger that ends that way. I think, somewhere, my mother would understand exactly why I needed to be the one to write it. Aunt Peggy, my father's younger sister, called me the week after the story made its way through the family the way these things do, in fragments, second-hand, over phone calls no one wanted to be the one to start. She'd never much cared for how my father split his attention between his daughters, and she told me, in her blunt way, that she'd watched it happen for 30 years and never once said a word because it wasn't her place. It was never my place either, apparently, I told her, until I made it my job. She laughed at that, the first real laugh anyone in my family had managed in weeks, and told me she was proud of me in a voice that made it clear she meant it as more than a courtesy. Gordon Pruitt kept the Millbrook store open under new management, a woman named Sheila Torres who'd worked the floor there for 9 years and knew the inventory better than anyone left standing. He told me, months later, over coffee after my second engagement for him wrapped, that business at the Millbrook location hadn't dipped at all after my father left, which surprised him and didn't surprise me in the slightest. A store, it turns out, is built by everyone who shows up for it, not by the one name on the sign who gets to decide who else gets to matter. I drove past the building once, this past spring, on my way to visit an old college friend still living in town. The green trim was freshly painted. A new sign hung above the door, Pruitt Home Hardware, the brass bell still audible even through my closed car window when a customer walked in for what looked like a bag of grass seed. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I'd already spent 11 weeks inside that building's history, and I'd finally closed the file on it the way I close every file, completely, on my own terms, with nothing left unverified. I still work Christmas mornings sometimes, but only when I choose to, on client engagements that can't wait for a holiday, and I make sure, every single year now, that whoever is on my team gets the same thing I never got as a child: a clear schedule, a fair shift, and the certainty that no one in the room is loved any less for showing up and doing the work. My name is Rennie Calloway. I'm 44 years old. I've spent 16 years finding the truth hidden inside other people's numbers, and it took me until this year to finally find it inside my own family's. My father made me work Christmas morning for 11 years so my sister could open presents in peace. He never once thought I'd grow up to read a ledger for a living. He never once imagined that the daughter he handed a calculator to, instead of a bicycle, would be the one who finally added everything up. I don't know if my father will ever fully understand what those 11 Christmas mornings cost me, or whether understanding it now, at 73, with a restitution schedule and an empty apartment 6 blocks from the store he built, even matters anymore in the way it might have mattered when I was 16 and still hoping. But I know what they cost him, finally, in a currency he understood better than any apology: $68,400, a career, and a daughter who spent 32 years being capable so that, one day, she'd be exactly capable enough to hand him the truth in a binder with numbered tabs, the same way he once handed her a calculator and called it fair. If someone in your family has ever made you feel like the reward for being reliable was simply more work, I want you to hear this clearly. Being capable was never something you had to earn by disappearing quietly into the background while someone else got to be delicate. It was a strength they didn't know how to properly thank you for, and one day, if you keep showing up for yourself the way you once showed up for everyone else, the numbers will finally balance. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I take my mother's ledger out of that drawer just to hold it for a minute before putting it back. I've thought a great deal about why she never showed it to anyone while she was alive, and I've come to believe it wasn't fear that kept her silent, not entirely. I think some part of her was doing the only kind of justice she knew how to do from inside a marriage she'd decided, rightly or wrongly, she wasn't going to leave. She counted. She documented. She kept the record straight even when she couldn't act on it. I like to think that if she were here now, she'd recognize exactly what I built in that binder as the finished version of what she started in that box, the report she never got to file, filed at last, by the daughter she raised to notice everything. Thank you for staying with me. If this story reminded you of a Christmas morning of your own, or a sibling who got the bicycle while you got the shift, drop a comment and tell me about it. If you believe the quiet ones are usually the ones keeping the real books, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to GM Mom Stories for more, and remember, the truth doesn't disappear just because no one checks it for a while. It waits, patiently, for someone who finally will.